Remember that the neurotransmitters are slightly different between the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. It's important for you to remember that for the parasympathetic nervous system, it always uses acetylcholine. For the sympathetic nervous system, it uses acetylcholine at the preganglionic neuron and norepinephrine at the postganglionic neuron. This diagram compares those differences. So we can see with the parasympathetic pathway, the preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine. And remember that the preganglionic neuron is long in the parasympathetic pathway, and it is short in the sympathetic pathway for the preganglionic neuron. The ganglionic neuron is what's going to release acetylcholine in the parasympathetic pathway. The term muscarinic or nicotinic you do not need to know. But remember that the ganglionic neuron is what has a cell body, and that always is where acetylcholine binds. So for the parasympathetic nervous system, it releases acetylcholine from the preganglionic neuron, and from the postganglionic neuron, it releases acetylcholine. Also, it's referred to as the effector postganglionic neuron because it's much shorter. It has a short postganglionic neuron for the parasympathetic nervous system pathway. For the sympathetic pathway, it's always going to release acetylcholine from the short preganglionic neuron. Again, the term nicotinic and muscarinic you can ignore. You should know that the term adrenergic only refers to the sympathetic nervous system because norepinephrine is what is released there. This pathway is one of the exceptions and one that you can kind of ignore because it's the only example of where the sympathetic pathway actually utilizes acetylcholine at the longer postganglionic neuron. So again, as long as you know one of them, you know the other because they're exactly opposite. For the other sympathetic pathway, the preganglionic neuron is going to release acetylcholine at the adrenal medulla. Again, you're going to ignore nicotinic. Once that acetylcholine is released, it's really a modified ganglia, which is the adrenal medulla. It's going to release lots of norepinephrine and epinephrine into the blood, which is going to raise blood pressure and also raise heart rate. The control of autonomic function is primarily in the hypothalamus, and it's the integration center for the autonomic nervous system. So it's super important for things like emotion, regulating visceral function of organs, but there can also be some central control of the autonomic nervous system as well in the brainstem and the spinal cord. The brainstem, as you've learned now, has the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And some of those regions control the heart, so cardiovascular function, digestive function, the pupil of the eye. So in the case of the sympathetic division, it's going to dilate the pupil as well as modify the lens shape. For the spinal cord, there are basic parasympathetic reflexes in it, like defecation and urination, which are controlled by the sacral region of the spinal cord. So remember that the sympathetic nervous system is thoracolumbar and parasympathetic is craniosacral. So this slide is kind of summarizing what we just talked about. We can see the hypothalamus here is the sort of the boss, if you will, of the autonomic nervous system. It's going to be the integration and command center for all autonomic functions and plays a role in emotions. However, there can also be reflex centers at the bottom of the brain, which is at the brainstem. This is pointing to the medulla. This is the pons, and this is the midbrain. The brainstem contains major autonomic nervous system reflex centers. And finally, the spinal cord is also going to control autonomic reflex centers, such as defecation, as well as urination through the sacral region of the spinal cord.